back to the channel, and today I'd like to tell you a little bit about how I got into reading. Now, if you're not new to the channel, you probably know that I grew up being read and reading books like Treasure Island and books like The Hobbit, Robin Hood, Wind in the Willows, William Tell, things like that, adventure stuff mostly. But I wasn't particularly good at reading, and I did struggle in my early years at school and with the fact of reading written text, a little bit of mild dyslexia and things like that. But one way it was encouraged to me is I had a half uncle, and he actually gave me a hand down. He was only a few years older than me. Book called The Shamutansi Hills, and this is a book by Steve Jackson. It's a text-based role-playing book. So you've got chapters throughout here, and you make decisions, and you go to chapters based on decisions you make. So it's in part novel, in part role-playing. It was called Fighting Fantasy. That's what they called it here. This was not my original copy. That was lost in the 90s through moving house and what have you. This is a 1984 copy of the 1983 book that I was given. Now, there were several books in this original series. I have 3 of them here: The Shamutansi Hills, City Port of Traps, and the 7 Serpents. Now, there was a 4th book and a spell book as well, which I used to own all of them. But unfortunately I don't have them anymore. I had to rebuy those for the purpose of this story. But as you can see behind me, this series spun off, it must have been somewhere between 50 and 100 books in the Fighting Fantasy series, and the first 50, which were released from 1984 to 1992, those are the ones I'm most familiar with. I must have probably read half of them, and they really did help encourage me get into reading at that time. Now, throughout the 80s, Dungeons and Dragons was still going pretty strong, and these did kind of offer a book enhanced version of Dungeons and Dragons, where maybe you didn't have to use your imagination as much. If you wanted to do some reading, this really gave you a halfway house between role playing and reading. It was an era when classic fantasy was really going strong still in the 80s, and video games hadn't really overtaken that element of children's imaginations. We still have quite rudimentary kind of video games at the time. Games like Adventure on the Atari weren't particularly good, so these kind of things were much more effective. And I know these are still being re-released in more modern forms now, or some of the books behind me at least. Now, Ian Livingstone was the other man working with Steve Jackson on these books, and he used to deal with some of the more sci-fi or otherworldly elements, and Steve Jackson used to do more classical fantasy from what I remember. But they were all pretty good. Books. They were all a lot of fun. I don't think they would be classed as very high literature, but certainly something you might want to check out, and tell me in the comments if you remember any of these, if you've ever read any of these when you were younger, or if these ring any bells with you. Cheers.